geoscience information and knowledge out to the public. And they decided that we were seemingly doing a pretty good job of that, and they wanted to come see what we were doing. And I have Andrei Gadafov, who's the Director of Development for AGI, just came along to enjoy Yellowstone and bounce ideas off of. They put a whole lot of interesting material up here with some great web links and that sort of stuff. If you need something to carry on the way home, grab it. It's available. They prefer not to have to fly it back to Washington, D.C. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Art. Are you going to introduce? Good, good.
So it's my privilege to introduce a friend tonight. And Dave Anderson has done 2 talks for us about making, one of them right in this very room, about making jewelry from fossilized dinosaur poop. And it's absolutely beautiful stuff. Today we're getting into another one of his passions. Dave is has a PhD from Columbia in astrophysics, and worked building detectors at CERN, Fermilab, all around the world. When he retired from particle physics, he started making the jewelry. Somehow, in between all that, he managed to write a book about flight, which took 10 years. Yeah, 10 years, and flight is widely misunderstood, and Dave will talk about that. Today you will learn about how the physics of flight really happens. So please join me in welcoming Dave Anderson.
Hi. What got me started on this was when I was an undergraduate, when I graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle. I actually knew quite a bit of physics. The one thing I didn't understand was I didn't understand how a wing-produced lift. I know what they taught me. I passed the tests. I could talk the talk. It didn't make sense to me, and the reason was it doesn't empower you. If you understand the conservation of energy, you can calculate how high a projectile goes without any fancy mathematics. Or you know that nobody can sell you a perpetual motion machine, no matter how convincing it is. But what they taught us about how lift was, and this is physics, taught you nothing. How does a plane fly upside down? How does a wing adjust for speed, change in load, change in air density? None of that was explained. And so it was like a stone in my shoe. For 20 years, it would just kind of nod in the background. The trouble is, the reason it took me 20 years to get it straight is that, I'm sorry to say, this is going to sound like heresy, everyone gets it wrong. And they've started you off on the wrong foot. So to try to get it right, it's like trying to write a ballet with a rumba being played in the room. So in the end, I had to just start from scratch. I was lucky enough to make contact with an aeronautical engineer. I had this false assumption that aeronautical engineers would know how a wing flies. Turns out they really don't. Okay. But I made contact with somebody at my old alma mater who he was kind enough to listen to me until he understood what I was doing. And I'll show you. I started making calculations, and suddenly he was starting to understand things intuitively that before he only understood mathematically. And at that point he came aboard. We went and we wrote a book. We took all of aeronautics, all of it. We took out all the equations with the exception of a few simple necessary ones and replaced it with basic physics and insight. The first edition came out 2000, then we did a second edition 2010, and for those who want a little more challenge, there's also the convenient Chinese translation. Okay. So anyway, my co-author is Scott Eberhardt. First book, he was working at the University of Washington. When we did the second, he was working at Boeing, so Boeing had to approve this book before it could be published. So it's not complete heresy. Okay, before I get started, I'd like to see hands. How many people feel that they have at least a basic understanding of how a wing produces lift? Be honest. No, be honest right now, before I said anything, okay? Okay. I'm going to ask that question 2 more times. The next time I hope no hands go up. And the third time I hope all the hands go up. Okay. So, anyway, the first thing I'm going to do is discuss what I'll call the plausible falsehoods. I found out from the beginning, if I don't make you understand what you've been thinking is wrong, it'll always be music in the background while I tell you what's right. So first I have to convince you, and then I'll tell you that about lift. I say here, it's not rocket science. Turns out it is. It's Newton's second law. Okay? That is really simple. It's even easier than what you've been taught. But then the third part, which you'll find, I hope, interesting, is the proof of the pudding. Once you understand flight, you'll see everything falls into place. You'll be able to understand everything. Should be inclusive enough. I'm going to start out with 3 points because these sometimes get confusing. First, Bernoulli is good physics. There's nothing wrong with the Bernoulli explanation or equation. It just has nothing to do with flight. It's one of the many misapplications of Bernoulli. Okay, it's nothing to do. The second one is, it's true, the pressure is reduced at the top on top of the wing to produce lift. I'm not saying that's wrong. The point is just how that happens. The third one, the acceleration of the air over the top of the wing, which is the basis for every explanation we've ever had, is just an insignificant product of lift. If lift were taught right from the beginning, they probably wouldn't even mention that it's accelerated. To say that acceleration causes a lift is kind of like saying birthdays are good for you. The more you have, the longer you live, right? Oh, what happened? Did I push the
wrong button? Oh. You pushed the black screen button, probably.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Oh, good.
Okay, so when I say negative things about Bernoulli explanation, I'm not saying anything wrong about Bernoulli. It's just that his name has been taken in vain, and so, like, you know, who is it? Brutus, I'm here to bury him, not to praise him, okay? Here is a typical explanation of, I'll call the popular description. You have what I'll call a Bernoulli wing. It's a wing with a bump on top. The air goes over the top, goes faster, and they use the Bernoulli principle which relates air pressure to airspeed to pressure. Since the airspeed increases, the pressure has to decrease, they tell you, and the wing flies. Well, first, that's not true. Anybody that has an airplane know that on the side of the airplane there's the static port. It's just a little hole where the altimeter and other instruments read the pressure. You sit there and it says, like, my airport was 7,500 feet. 7,500 feet. You do a run-up, the air is probably going 100 miles an hour over the static port, and it says 7,500 feet. Then you run down the runway and you're almost 100 miles an hour, and the static port still reads 100 feet. And the air is going now maybe 200 miles an hour over the static port. So just because the air is going faster doesn't mean it has a lower pressure. That's one of the things that we've been taught that's wrong. So the first point is, in the popular description, is the lift depends on the shape of the wing. The second one, air accelerates over the top of the wing. There's a variety of explanations people give. Some it's the equal transit time. The air that goes over the top has to meet at the same time with the air. That's completely wrong. The greater the lift, the sooner it gets there. So some know that equal transit time isn't right, so then they say, well, it has to go farther, which is just equal transit time light. Okay? And others just don't even explain it. And then often you'll see the air coming off just the way it came on. If that wing has done nothing to the air has done nothing to the wing. Okay? So then they use the Bernoulli principle. They claim that if you know the speed, you know the pressure, and also no work is done. As I said, the air comes off. They never talk about work, but we know that a plane, you know, a 800,000 pound airplane is clearly doing a lot of work to stay in the air.
Can I ask you a favor? If you stood back a couple of feet, we could see what's up there.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. My pleasure. Okay, so, but people have known there's a problem. That's why there's a variety of explanations. One is circulation theory. Oops. Circulation theory. I'll give it to you real brief and not very kindly, because it's mathematics, it's not even physics. Circulation theory is basically as the wing accelerates down the runway, air circulates around the wing, comes down at the trailing edge, up at the leading edge, and forms what they call a bound vortex. Okay? The bound vortex stays on the wing. Since it's going up at the beginning, at the leading edge, the wing essentially flies into its own upwash. So again, you have lift without work. It's, you know, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. Okay, and then when it lands, the bound vortex jumps off, hides behind a tree, and waits for the next plane. But even though it's wrong, it's mathematics. It's not physics. Okay, oops. One of the clear things is how does the wing fly upside down? This is from a soaring manual. Of course, when they explain how the plane flies right side up, they use the Bernoulli explanation. But then even here they say for flying upside down, if you use Bernoulli, you can prove that a wing can't fly upside down. So then they introduce the third, oops, wrong button. They introduce the third variant, where the air strikes the bottom and bounces off. And this, many people think, is the Newtonian description of lift. First, the wing doesn't intercept enough air. You'll see how much air is really diverted. And so, like, Will Rogers, what he said about naming near beer, and these people are like that. Whoever named it was wrong twice. Well, this guy gets it wrong twice. Okay, so people know there's a problem. Okay, first, lift depends on the shape. I've already given you one thing that sounds like heresy, that Bernoulli has nothing to do with lift. The second piece of what will sound like heresy is that the shape of the wing has nothing to do with lift. It has everything to do with stall characteristics and cruise, but nothing to do with lift. To show you this, I'm going to define effective angle of attack. Aeronautical engineers define angle of attack geometrically, independent of the response of the wing. So some wings with zero angle of attack have lift, some wings with zero angle of attack don't have lift. So I'm defining effective angle of attack as the angle into the air that the wing has zero lift. You can always, like your hand out the window, you can always find, if it's down, it goes down, goes up. So you can always find a zero. That's the zero angle of attack. This is lift as a function of effective angle of attack for two wings. You see that this is, I'll call a Bernoulli wing, and this is a thin symmetric wing, and they both have exactly the same lift as a function of angle of attack. Where they change is that they have different stall characteristics. But the fact that it's a straight line means that those wings upside down will have exactly the same lift and exactly the same effective angle of attack. All wings fly just as well upside down as right side up. And it turns out any wing design, I have a book with 100 and something wing designs, they're all exactly like that. What varies is because of definition, zero goes back and forth a little bit. And not only that, if you correct for area and aspect ratio, that's length of the wing over the divided by the root size, they all have the same slope. It's, oops, sorry, fat fingers. It's the slope. In some English engineering units, it's 4 pi, yard tons per fortnight or something. But anyway, it's the same for all wings. A barn door, a Bernoulli wing upside down, it's the same for everything, all wings. So the lift has nothing to do with the shape. It does, on the other hand, okay, told you. I'm sorry, don't want to get ahead of myself. So maybe not everybody knows what a stall is. I won't worry about how a wing produces lift yet, but just to understand the ends of those curves. Clearly, if you have a wing, very small angle of attack, you have no problem with the air flowing over the top. And if the wing were at 90 degrees, you would have no air flowing. It would be just turbulence. Well, the wing goes smoothly. As you go to greater and greater angle, it starts to stall at the rear and work its way forward. That's for a nice smooth. That's why you have a nice round end on there. So you go gently into a stall. Fighter planes, on the other hand, they fly razor blades. They have no thickness, and some planes have been so sharp you cut your hand running your hand on it. And so they go abruptly into a stall. It's a real surprise for the pilot when they first fly one of these. Instead of going gently into a stall like they used to, they just go wham. Okay.
F-104.
Yeah. They just. Yeah, it must be a real surprise the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Especially the Germans.
Yeah. Well. Okay. So anyway, that's a stall. I'll refer to stall, and it depends on the angle, not the speed. At a certain angle, you're actually asking too much from the wing, and it stalls. It doesn't matter how big an engine you have, unless you can fly with just your engine. So anyway, let's look at some wings. The first one here, I took this up at Oshkosh, is symmetric. That clearly isn't a Bernoulli wing. And in fact, since the Second World War, almost all planes are almost symmetric. My Cessna 182, the difference between the leading edge of the middle of the leading edge to the middle of the trailing edge, going over the top and the bottom, the difference in path length is 2.5%. Basically symmetric. And these planes, they certainly aren't flying Bernoulli wings. You can't really tell, but they're razor blades. See, it's very thin. And this one's upside down. You don't see it flying at a great angle. It's flying at almost the same angle as the one up above. The only reason it's not exactly the same, it might even be the same. They probably put them on flat because they go so fast. Okay, so I hope you understand the shape of the wing has nothing to do with lift. So any explanation that depends on the shape of the wing is wrong. So what do we have next? Okay, air accelerates to produce lift. First, let's look at Newton's first law, which is a body at rest will remain at rest or in motion, in straight line motion, unless acted on by a force. That's pretty simple. So now you start out the explanation with the air accelerates. But you can't have an acceleration without a force. So the question is, where's the force that causes the acceleration that causes the force? In fact, if you just, oops, back fingers. If you just go no farther than that, then that's a complete violation of Newton's first law, which has not been repealed. But in fact, you'll see the force causes the acceleration, but the force that causes the acceleration is the lift. It's just air being sucked in by the lower pressure. It's not the lower pressure causing the acceleration causing the lower pressure. So number 2 is wrong. Bernoulli. Okay, it's a nice statement of the conservation of energy, but that means the system cannot have any energy added or subtracted from it. Well, oops, excuse me. So anyway, if that's true, then it relates pressure to velocity. And they don't describe pressure. Even in physics, they never went far enough. The aeronautic engineers understand this, but they never told the physicists. The static pressure is the pressure measured perpendicular to the flow. That's what the static port measures. The dynamic pressure is the pressure, if the air is going faster and you put your hand in it, you'd feel an increase in pressure. That's the dynamic pressure. That's increased. That's what the pitot tube measures. And if energy is conserved, the static pressure and the dynamic pressure, being the total pressure, is constant. It's just that the velocity of the molecules have swung up, so fewer hitting here and more hitting here. Okay, so that's what, when they say static pressure, they just mean perpendicular to the flow. Okay, so this requires that no energy be added or subtracted. But clearly, lift requires work. Here's relative fuel flow as a function of weight for a heavy Boeing jet at a constant speed. And you see that the greater the weight, oops. Yeah, the greater the weight, the greater the fuel flow. In fact, you'll see, once you understand, you'll be able to calculate, just without even a piece of paper, that the fuel flow goes as the load squared. Okay. So that's why the big planes have the big engines, and that's why when you shut them off, they come to ground. And so that violates the Bernoulli principle. I mean, so that means that the velocity and the pressure above a wing are not related by the Bernoulli principle.
But that's not a squared function. You go from 300 to 16, you go from 1 to 1.
Now the problem here is it's a heavy. And so the problem is, as it's going, it's changing the drag of the fuselage, which a small plane won't do.
Okay.
Okay, but it's not linear either.
Correct.
Okay, so, okay, so as I said, the relation between V and P are related by the Bernoulli principle on the description, you know, the Bernoulli wing. Okay, it's not true. In fact, it's not true in a big way. What a wing actually does, the energy, the work that's being done, the fuel that's being burned to produce the lift, is going into kinetic energy in air that's accelerated straight down. When a wing flies along, it's accelerating air straight down, and the energy to produce that lift is just the kinetic energy left behind in that air. Same as a propeller. The inefficiency of a propeller is the kinetic energy left behind in the air. Now, I'll show you that. You'll believe it when I'm through. Okay. Let's see if I got a sip here. Okay. Let's do a thought experiment, or for those of German bent, a Gedanken experiment. Okay. A goose is flying along, high altitude, loses a feather. Feather's floating down, and a wing passes underneath it, say a foot underneath it. And this event's being recorded by 2 cameras, one fastened to the wing and one on a tethered balloon fixed with the air. So now we look at what we see. The one fastened to the wing does exactly what we think it would do. Streaks over, comes out with a downwash, at a downward angle. So you can say, well, you know, there's a fluid. Bernoulli might work. Circulation theory isn't ruled out, and this is exactly what we'd expect to see. But what does the tethered camera see? It sees the balloon going straight, the feather going straight down. Now we're in a situation where the air is standing still and the wing is moving, and this is actually the situation of real flight. So now we don't have a fluid, so you can't apply Bernoulli to this. Okay, so. Okay, so this is just an example. You're accelerating air straight down to produce a lift straight up. That's Newton's third law, equal and opposite forces. Okay? Here's a helicopter hovering over the water. Clearly it's blowing air straight down to produce a lift straight up. Here is a hurricane. What's happening here is the conditions are just right to where the tip has low enough pressure where it's causing fog, essentially. And you can see here that the air goes straight back. It doesn't come off at an angle, it goes straight back. So the air from a propeller also makes a nice tight cone. It's going straight back.
So the plane is not moving in that picture?
No. It's just the air is moving. Okay, but now, here's a plane that is moving. This plane has flown above the clouds, not through it. In fact, I talked to the photographer. He took this picture from the tail gunner position on a B-17. He said he had the best job in the world. So anyway, that plane has flown above, and you can see the downwash has gone straight down and made a hole in the clouds. Okay? So what do we have here? Okay. Now the thing is, one camera sees the feather going across, like we're familiar with. One sees the feather going straight down. But the thing is, they're both observing the same event, and therefore they're both observing the same physics. So the physics can't depend on the observation, you know, the reference frame of the observer. That wing and that feather and that air do not know you're watching. So any true explanation of lift has to work in both reference frames. Okay? So that's the acid test. If you can't explain why that feather went straight down and why the feather looks like it did in a wind tunnel, you don't have the right explanation. So now, how many people think they understand how a wing produces lift? To be honest, we got one bright guy. Or smart. Okay, I believe that. Okay, no, that's good. Okay, so anyway, it doesn't depend on the observer. And here's the relationship of the two. This is what the balloon sees. This is, my fingers are the buds are too close for I'm going to give up on this. This is what the balloon sees, and this is what the wing camera sees, and they're just related by the speed. One is just looking at the feather being, one is a moving reference frame, and the other one is a fixed. Okay. And so sometimes it's easier to discuss lift in the reference frame of the wing camera in this. Sometimes I'll use the other reference frame because it's easier to see. So when it sees, I hate to say air sees anything, it sees a descending surface. And it's like a piston being pulled down. It tries to draw a vacuum. The air tries to fill that vacuum, or does fill it, but that forms a vacuum above it. And that propagates out at the speed of sound, and that's the air is pulling on this column of air above it. And you've got to remember, the wings are big and the plane is fast. This is really a huge force. But it has nothing, in this case, there's no flowing fluid. It's just going straight down. Now if you look in a wind tunnel, but now the situation is the balloon is moving with the wind, you see the same thing. Exactly the same pictures. And again, the two are related. Now it's by airspeed, not by the speed of the wing. It turns out it doesn't matter with respect between the molecules of air and the wing. It doesn't matter if the wing is moving and the air is standing still, or the air is moving and the wing is standing still. It's just the relation between the two. That's why wind tunnels are useful, because they're just the opposite of what you do in a real flight. In real flight, the wing moves, and in a wind tunnel, the air moves. And the fact is, it's the same physics. And so, if you look at it in the wind tunnel perspective, the air flowing over the wing sees a receding surface, and we say it's incompressible. That also means you can't form a vacuum. So it tries to form a vacuum, and the streamline is pulled down, and that pulls down the streamline ahead, and again it propagates out. And so it's the same physics, just a slightly different explanation. But still, that result is downward. Okay, so it's just a relative motion that counts. So now let's go back to the air being accelerated down and lift. Now we use Newton's second law. We're all familiar, many are familiar with second law, force equals mass times acceleration. There's also an expression, it's called the differential expression. Oh, this didn't show very well. Okay, something about, imagine there's a dot above this M. You see, it didn't show it.
Vector.
Huh?
It's a vector?
No, it's a time derivative.
Okay.
This is what you'd have from a rocket. F equals m, the change in mass per time times the velocity of that mass. So this m dot is like kilograms per second, and v is the velocity. So if you have a rocket and it's expelling so many kilograms per second at a certain velocity, you have the thrust of the rocket. Same thing with the airplane. Okay, mv is the momentum. M dot v is just the rate of momentum transfer. So here we have it. The lift on that wing is just, again, m dot v. V, the vertical component of the air, times the amount of mass. So if you want to increase the lift on a wing, you either increase the vertical velocity or you increase the amount of air. So now I'll show you how this goes. Now I'm going to go to the wrist frame of the wind tunnel. It's just easier to see. I hope my fat fingers don't. This is the angle of attack. This is the speed. This is the speed of the air. This is the downwash. This is the vertical velocity. That's how they're related. Okay. If you double the angle of attack, you double the vertical velocity. If you double the speed, you double the vertical velocity. So what that shows is that the vertical velocity depends on the angle of attack and the speed. This is how you adjust lift on an airplane. You just adjust the angle of attack. Unfortunately, the big jets can't do that. Their wings are put at a certain angle of attack, and they you don't want to change that because you're moving the big fuselage. So you'll see they change it by changing speed and by changing altitude, and not angle of attack, except maybe for small corrections. Now, m dot. So, okay, we have vertical velocity is proportional to speed and angle of attack. The way to look at the amount of mass that's diverted, look at the wing as like a scoop, okay, and proportional to the area of the wing. Bigger the wing, the more air is diverted. The faster you go, the more air that's scooped up. And the density, the lower the density, the less mass you scoop up. So that's how that works. It doesn't depend on load, it doesn't depend on angle of attack. But even...
I'm concerned, what do you mean by scoop?
Well, it turns out there's mathematical basis for this, and I'll show you. But
I'm not understanding what you're trying to communicate with.
Okay, pretend there's a rim on the wing, a band. And you're just looking at how much air goes through that band.
Okay.
Okay, you're scooping up air. I don't mean this at the bottom. It's just how much air does that wing intercept and divert.
So why is the scoop thicker above the fuselage than at the wingtips?
I'm glad you asked.
Okay, good.
Well, it's got the problem that there's the wing is a mid-wing, but you can see this is fog. You can see how the wing, the lift is near the root and dissipate and gets smaller to the end. Okay. In fact, you see these planes with the winglets. It's called a boundary value problem. You have to go to 0 at the wingtip, okay, because it communicates around the end. The first reason for winglets, which is this thing they add to the end here. The first reason is they're sexy. Like when the 737 was being sold as a corporate jet, they said it had to have winglets. The problem, what happens is, with the winglet, you no longer communicate around the end, so now the lift goes farther out. Changes the lift distribution, but also allows more lift for the same length of wing. So the solution for the FAA, first they didn't want to do it because it wasn't tested for that low distribution, but then they said, well, corporate jets aren't going to fly as much, so they allow them to have winglets. There is a winglet is essentially the same as increasing the length of the wing. And there's kind of a 50% rule they go by. A 4-foot winglet is equivalent to a 2-foot extension on the wing. So that's why it's more in the middle.
4-foot winglet high?
Yeah, length.
Yeah. What do you mean?
It's like a winglet looks like a wing.
Height.
Yeah, this length.
Height.
Yeah, well, somewhere around like this.
Okay.
But yeah, but it's only, yes.
So it's my understanding that those aren't put on there for sexy or lift. It's to kill that trailing vortice. If you go back a few.
Yeah, I know.
And it doesn't affect.
But that's no. But see, forget wingtip vortices. That's one of those things that had to be used to make things work when you didn't know what was. No, it's not a loss of energy.
If you think the airlines are going to spend 10 cents on something that's sexy.
No. It buys them 2 feet of wing on each side, so that, and you'll see that a larger wing is more efficient. So they actually save fuel by it, and they don't have to increase their length on the ground.
But I thought that was reducing the tip vortice, not.
I'm not sure it doesn't increase it.
I think it reduces. in this picture here is a good example because you have a pressure differential over the wing creating the cloud,
Yeah.
the fog. But the wingtip, what do they call these things? Winglets. Keeps the pressure differential higher as you approach the wingtip.
In fact, if you look at,
It's as if the wing were deeper.
yeah,
Yes.
the wing has what a wing we call wing vortex. It's a sheet of air coming, well, in that frame, or if even it's going straight down, okay? The velocity changes as you go out, and because of the change in velocity, it curls toward the slower velocity. And so the rate of change along the wing determines how tight. The greater the change, the tighter it is, and it's the greatest at the wing, but that's after it's left the wing.
So
It's
now-
just the downwash is curling after it's left the wing.
So now looking at that picture, is my assumption correct that where I see the thicker fog is more lift?
Yes.
Okay, so now if I put a winglet, a 4-foot-high winglet on the plane,
Yeah, like here.
would I
This
not
would come-
expect to see the cloud 2 feet high at the winglet?
I don't know how high, but yes.
Higher.
Higher. It's still probably some, but yes. This would, instead of tapering to 0 here, would taper to some value.
So in a way, if you look at that cloud, that's almost defining the lift you're getting.
It's certainly the shape.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well. I had another one I took out. It's called a flat vortex. It was a plane coming in, and the wingtip vortex wasn't at the end of the wing, it was at the end of the flap, because that was the greatest rate of change. So I'm not sure. You put a winglet in, you now have a greater rate of change. It goes from a higher number to 0 instead of slowly going to 0. So if I had to guess, I would guess that a winglet increases the wingtip vortex, because now you have a greater change in velocity. But I'm not going to argue because I don't know the answer, okay? And that's neither here nor there for this talk. Okay, so how much air is diverted down? You'll see things in books that lift is a surface effect. I've seen it where they draw one thin line that said lift, and then unaffected air. So we took a Cessna 172, weighing 2,300 pounds, going 140 miles an hour, and assumed a reasonable angle of attack of 5 degrees. Gives us a vertical velocity of 6 miles per hour. Turns out we're diverting 5 tons per second. 5 times the weight of the airplane per second, but very slow. So then working back to see if this even makes sense, it turns out, because now you have all the numbers working back, it turns out it's 209 horsepower. So that's good for a ballpark measure. It's not 1 horsepower and it's not 1,000 horsepower. It's right there. So, and in fact, to decrease that number, you have to actually increase the mass. Commercial jets divert about their own weight. The reason it's not 5 times has to do with higher wing loading. So you see, it diverts a lot of air, and that's where the energy goes into, and you can't get around it. Okay, how big is the scoop? Just to be simple-minded, I made the scoop rectangular rather than getting anything fancy. Again, Cessna 172, 3,000 feet above, and 36-foot wingspan, comes out to be the height about 18 feet. So that's the order of magnitude of how much air is being diverted, and that's why it works. It's a lot of air. M dot is big, so V is small, and you'll see. So, anyway, it's not a surface effect.
So is it the shape of the wing that's causing the diversion?
No, the shape of the wing has nothing to do with it.
Okay, so
It's the angle of attack.
Okay, so it's the angle at the bottom of the wing.
No, the top of the wing.
Top of the wing.
The bottom of the wing does nothing, and I'll show you that.
Okay.
It does not. It's all the top of the wing. In fact, you don't want the air to hit the bottom of the wing, because if it hits it, it's very high drag. Fortunately, the angles are small, and the surface, you've got a surface effect that eases it around. So, in fact, okay. So, just review before we go on. The lift is proportional to m dot v.
Again, what is M dot?
Amount of mass per second, kilograms per second diverted.
I mean, it's dmdt.
Yeah, but
Derivative?
yeah, it's a derivative.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure everybody knows that, so
Well,
I just use it.
okay.
So and in physics, the m dot would be the time derivative. Okay, dmdt, amount of mass per second. Okay, we saw that the amount of mass is proportional to the speed of the wing, also the density if you go higher. But since it's fixed on, it's a fixed airplane, it's proportional to the speed. The vertical velocity is proportional to the angle of attack and speed. And so basically that's all you need to do to calculate everything for a wing. And the calculations I'm going to show you are correct. That's the way I got this aeronautical engineer involved. I started to do these calculations, and then he started to, show me that I was right. And then he said, then he got to understand things physically instead of intuitively. I mean, intuitively instead of mathematically, and that's when he came aboard. Okay. So, what happens when you increase the speed? Let's say you double the speed of the airplane. So m dot doubles, but so does the vertical velocity. Since the mass hasn't, and you can't control m dot, you have to reduce the vertical velocity by a factor of 2. Okay, so that m dot is 2 times and v is 1/2. But since if you just reduced the vertical velocity to what it was before, it's already doubled, you're still twice as lift you want. So you have to decrease the angle of attack by a factor of 4. So the angle of attack goes as 1 over the speed squared. The faster you go, the lower your angle of attack. The slower you go, the greater your angle of attack. That's why when you're on the backside of the power curve, you're looking at the sky before you fall out. Okay. So the angle of attack goes as 1 over speed squared. You couldn't get that from Bernoulli. Okay. So the faster you go, the smaller the angle of attack. So what happens when you increase altitude? It's to say you say the same speed, you got the same load. So the faster you go, the higher you go, the less air you divert. And so m dot shrinks. So you have to increase the angle of attack to increase the vertical velocity to maintain. So the higher you go, the greater the angle of attack. In fact, that's what limits you. When you finally get to where your angle of attack is the stall angle of attack, you stall. Okay. What happens when you increase the load? Let's say you're flying your 152 and Scotty beams down a sumo wrestler into the side, another seat. Now, the load has increased, but let's say you're not going any faster, so m dot hasn't increased, so you have to double the vertical velocity, so you have to double the angle of attack. And this is, okay. This is something you won't find in any aeronautics book. It's power. And that was the two tricks to really understanding flight for me was to go to the reference frame where the wing was moving and the air was standing still, which removed all the flowing fluids and made it clear. The other thing is power. I got here a book, one of the classic textbooks. The only power they talk about is of an engine, but it turns out that's the most important. That's the way to understand flight. Power is just, there's induced power. It's just the energy that you put in the air that you leave behind to produce lift. That's induced power. Parasite power is the power of dragging the antennas and the wheels through the air. And the total power, of course, just the sum. So how does the induced power go? Okay, the energy in a molecule or anything is 1/2 mv squared. Okay, so, and that means, and so the rate, that's energy, and power is just energy per second. So m dot v squared is proportional to the power, induced power. So, or proportional to the lift times the velocity of the air. So, you plot it. What happens if you double the speed, m dot doubles, so v is halved, and I said it was load times v. So the induced power goes as the load times the, okay, induced power goes as 1 over the speed. You double, okay. Yeah, because you've halved v, p has gone half. So this is the backside of the power curve. Nowhere have I ever, and I've looked, nowhere have they ever seen a derivation of the power curve for an airplane. It's simple. It's just 1 over speed is the backside. The slower you go, the more power it takes to fly. In the early days when planes had no power, Langley told people that a plane took less power the faster it went, and they just dismissed him. And he was right. Okay, what about parasite power? That's easy. When a molecule hits the plane, it's 1/2 mv squared. And the number, so there's a speed squared term. And the number of molecules hitting just goes speed. You go twice as fast, you get twice as many hits. So the parasite power goes as a speed cubed. And this is front side.
But now if you're flying higher,
It's linear.
It's linear.
Yeah, linear. Half the density, half the.
Yeah.
It's just that. It's that second term.
Yeah.
Okay. So you put the two together, and you have the power curve. Okay. And you'll know where. Well, you'll find that for any plane derived. And the thing is, you have a brand new airplane, especially if it's a small one. You go up. You measure the power curve in 2 places, and you have the complete power curve for that airplane, independent of what airplane it is. This is true for all airplanes, except when you get to where the big fuselages are changing things. But for anything that we would fly, you know, with basically teardrop shape, that's the power curve. There's only 2. It's just 2 unknowns. So you measure 2 points, and you have it. And when you're at cruise, you're dominated by the parasite power, and that goes as the speed cube. So you would have to increase the size of your engine by a factor of 8 to double the speed. So when you put in that big engine, you really don't go much faster. You just climb faster. Okay, and this is why you finally run out. Well, you stall. But this is why the slower you go, the more you look up into the air. Okay. Engineers only work with drag, which you can't derive. That's why they have computers and stuff. But drag is just power divided by speed. And since you already know induced power is 1 over speed, induced drag is just 1 over speed squared. And parasite power is speed cubed. Parasite drag is speed squared. There you have that. And in fact, you use the same constants that you did when you measured the power curve. And so there's the drag curve, just falls out, which you can't, I don't know any other way, without a computer. What happens, what's the effect of load on stall speed? Oop. Yeah, I gotta
Find a little button.
Yeah, well, it's okay. Oh, let's see. You had another one. Laser. Yeah. Can I borrow that?
You want just a laser?
Yeah. Oh, here. Good. Yeah, because I'm not doing. No, wait. Oh, I see. The other buttons are neutral. Okay. Here is the angle of attack is a function of speed, and here's the angle of attack as a function of speed in a 2G turn. So now what you've done is you're in a turn that's where the load on the plane is twice the load. It's 2 Gs. And so you see that this is now the angle of attack, and since the stall angle of attack is constant, the speed of the stall has increased. So this is what they mean when they tell you you can stall at any speed. You just have to put enough load on it to where it requires an angle of attack that the plane will stall at. Okay. Effective altitude on power. If you go higher, the m-dot, the amount of mass diverted, decreases, so you have to go to a higher vertical velocity. And since the power goes as the load, constant, times the vertical velocity, the higher you go, the more power it takes to produce lift. But the parasite power, the higher you go, the less molecules are hitting. So that, and since it cruise, you're dominated by parasite power. So you still win. But the higher you go, the induced power starts to creep up. And when you finally get to the top, it's where all your power is needed just to produce lift. And that's as high as the plane will go. Okay, effective load on induced power. On yeah, effective, I'm sorry, I'm getting tired. Effective loading on induced power. What happens if you double the load, like we did in the 2G turn? Now both the load has increased, so we have to increase V twice. But now the load has increased, so that's a factor of 2, and V's increased a factor of 2. So we come out that the induced power goes as a load squared. And that's why it's worth lightening up an airplane. And that's why the last passenger on the plane costs more than the passenger before him. Since it's a square function, everyone costs more than the person in front of them in fuel. You can't say, well, it's going anyway. Okay. Now this will maybe get a little more interesting. Effective area on the wing area. You increase the wing area, you increase m dot, therefore you lower the velocity, and therefore you lower the power for the lift. Okay, so larger wings are more efficient. Unfortunately, large wings aren't very good at high speed, and they're heavy, and you've got that power increases load squared. So that's why you have to, it's a compromise. So in physical terms, you want to have maximize momentum, mv, and you want to minimize kinetic energy, mv squared. That explains why gliders are very efficient. They fly in the realm where they're dominated by induced power. Helicopters are less efficient. They have small wings, so they have to accelerate a lot of air at a high velocity. And fan jets are much more efficient than turbojets. Yes?
Can you explain that last one?
I will.
Okay.
I got a picture.
Good.
Okay. Here's a rather extreme glider.
Yep.
These gliders can have glide ratios of 60 to 1. Meaning for every foot it drops, it'll soar 60 feet. They also are killers. And they also load them with, they can carry up to 500 pounds of water. They want them heavy, which is not what you would think. But that's for penetration. You can't penetrate the air with a feather.
Momentum.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Here's a turboprop. Okay.
Fan jet.
Fan jet. Thank you. Thank you. As I say, getting tired. This is the jet engine, and it drives a turbine. I'm not sure how this is the General Electric. I'm not sure. Exhaust comes out here, but it turns the shaft, which turns the propeller. There's a thing called a bypass ratio, the ratio of the air that goes past the engine to that goes through the engine. Typical bypass ratios are 8 to 1. 8/9 of the air coming out of that engine never went through the firebox. So ideally, they have the exhaust from the jet the same velocity as the exhaust from the fan. So it means 8/9 of the thrust is due to a fan. You're really on a propeller-driven airplane. It's a turboprop. Yeah, it's a ducted propeller, exactly. Okay. Now, there's a Beechcraft Starship. Prettiest plane I've ever saw. And unfortunately, piece of junk. Yeah, and I won't tell you who designed it, but his initials are Rutan. Anyway, it's a pretty airplane. It cost $3 million to make. Some of them were sold for $50,000 for parts. Some of them were bought back and chopped up. There's a reason all airplanes look alike after 100 years. The tail, the horizontal stabilizer, tail on a plane actually are loading the wing. It's actually pulling the tail down. A small plane, the tail can add 200 pounds to the weight on the wing. The weight's lifting the weight of the plane plus 200 pounds. And that's for for safety. When it stalls, you want the tail to come up, the nose to go down. If the tail went down, well, you'd buy the farm. So they figure that's inefficient. So there's this called Canard, where you don't have a tail. You have essentially, they're not called horizontal stabilizers. You have the Canards up front. Canards are just French for duck. And so now the nose is lifted. The nose is heavy. The nose is lifted. And so all the surfaces are lifting. You would think that would be more efficient. It's not. Because as much as 1/3 of the weight has to be carried on those thin canards. So you're doing too much work with too small of a wing, which we saw was inefficient. So in fact, canards are less efficient, except they use them in military, of course, for pulling the nose around stuff. Also, it's got pushers. and you don't see pushers. And that's because the airflow across the wing is disturbed by a pusher. They spoil the airflow on the wing. And so, as pretty as it is, just the fact that it doesn't look like every other airplane is the reason you should be doubtful. All the lift is from the top of the wing. Okay. You can spoil the bottom of the wing all you want. See this plane here? Clearly, they've completely destroyed the bottom of the wing, but not the top. And that's why it's common to see struts on the bottom of a wing, but never on the top, because the strut on top of the wing would ruin the airflow. So this is another example that all the lift is from the top of the wing. I think we're almost through. Okay. So conclusion. If somebody asks you, how does a wing produce lift? It's simple. Because of angle of attack, the top of the wing draws air straight down to produce a force straight up. And the force is just proportional to the amount of air that's diverted from the horizontal to the vertical times its velocity. That's lift on a wing. And with that, you saw the power, which you can derive everything. And with what we were taught with the Bernoulli explanation or circulation or whatever, you had no tools to work with. And the results I gave you, in fact, have all been checked out.
How does drawing air straight down on the top of the wing produce a lift up?
Newton's third law, equal and opposite forces.
Same way a rocket.
You say your air is coming down and forcing
Yeah, but
the
you're
wing
pulling it down.
Right.
You're pulling it down, so that's the force. The lift force is what's pulling the air down. Let's see.
It's kind of the same idea as a rocket.
It's the same as firing a rifle. Okay? Momentum goes that way, momentum goes this way. It's just, you can't pull air down for nothing. So the momentum that you transfer to the air is the equal and opposite is transferred to the wing. It's the wing pulling it down. It's the suction that's accelerating the air that's holding the wing up.
Yeah, that's the key point there. You said the suction. You've created a pressure differential that accelerates the air above the wing downward.
Yeah, and then the wing gets out of the way.
Yeah, and then the wing gets out of the way. But that pressure differential was created by the motion of the wing at an angle of attack through the air.
Yeah.
And because the air going over top, this air down below is
not
doing anything. It's the air up above is being sucked down.
It's trying to form a vacuum.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, and you can't do that. It's trying to form a vacuum, and the air doesn't like it. So it's
Let me try it a different way. I think what you're trying to say is I'm lifting the airplane from the top instead of pushing it from the
Well, no,
top.
you're pushing it. You're just removing the load from the top.
Well, let's try.
I mean, pressure can only go one direction. So what you're doing really is you're removing the load. You draw a vacuum. You know, like when you draw a vacuum on a tin can that collapses, the vacuum didn't collapse it.
Right, but you're pulling that up.
Yeah, the pressure on the bottom basically has to.
So lift really does suck.
Yeah. You got that.
If you take the photo you had of the jet with all the bombs under it,
Yeah.
and the guy flies upside down, what happens to your...
Oh, well.
It doesn't do
Now
that.
now he's spoiled the top.
They don't usually do
Yeah. Yeah.
It's an extreme circumstance.
We're assuming clean wings. Okay. Okay, I got just a little more. Now I'm going to show you some of the misapplications of Bernoulli. The world's full of them. In fact, the only real application I know of Bernoulli that we've ever been taught is a carburetor. The rest are all not true. Let's see, we've got to get the right.
Civil engineers are happy about it.
Did the blank.
Right.
No, it works well for compressors or incompressible.
Okay.
There you go.
There's the famous Bernoulli strip. Those strip of paper. I don't know if this will work. Yeah, maybe. No, it's too heavy. Little strip of paper, and you blow across the top, and the thing comes up. That's a Bernoulli strip. Everybody knows that's the physics of lift on a wing. Okay, let's see, maybe that'll work. Hey? So let's see.
Yeah.
Okay, and they say, well, it's because your breath has a lower static pressure, and so it sucks it up. No, it's just a wing. It's just tracked along there. It forced the air to bend, and so there has to be an equal and opposite force on there, and it's just momentum transfer that pull it up. Your breath does not have a lower static pressure. A stream of air that's not confined does not have a lower static pressure. If it had a higher one, it would expand. If it had a lower one, it would contract to match the surrounding environment. There's no pipe there, and there's no magic. Ping pong ball in the exhaust of a vacuum cleaner. You've seen that where they put it there, and they say that's Bernoulli. When it tries to get to the side, you know, lower pressure on the inside draws it in. No, it's just that when you get to the side, less air is going here and more air is here, so you have an asymmetric flow. It's pulling air out, which draws this in, having nothing to do. The static pressure is the same all the way across here. Two ping pong balls on a string, you blow between them, they come together. It's not your breath has a lower static pressure. Again, it's just the air being tracked around the ball, pulling it in, just like on a wing. And the last one, which is a good one, if I can find the right button, the curveball. That's often attributed to Bernoulli. If you take a ball and it doesn't spin, air goes around. Oh, which one is this? Air goes around like this, and there's a little stall in the back here. And so there's a drag force. Now you have a ball with stitching on it, and you put a spin on it, it gets air spinning. On the top, where the attached air is going against the flow, it stalls early. Where the air is going with the flow, it stalls later, so you get an asymmetric stall. And that's what makes a curveball. Again, having nothing to do with the thing that spinning does not, you know, fulfill Bernoulli's requirements. I mean, it's just an asymmetric stall. And I told you that, you know, engineers don't understand lift. There's a really, really nice guy. He's the University of Maryland, I think. He writes the classic textbooks. This is the 3rd edition. I mean, and I've talked to him. He's a senior guy, might even be emeritus now. I talked to him, I have communicated with maybe 2 years ago. It took me a week before he realized that a wing blew air straight down. And he writes the books. And he didn't know how a wing flew. And not anywhere in here will you see power, but you saw that power was the key to understanding everything in wings. So it turns out people did understand how wings flew until the Second World War. Then they got computers and they turned off their brains. Okay? And with that, I say thank you. Oh, how many people think they have at least a basic idea of how a wing flies? That's good enough. That's worth coming down for.
A question over here. Comment?
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned the Canard wing.
Yeah.
They can, if you're not worried about efficiency, you can do some marvelous things in your flight envelope with a Canard.
Oh, yeah.
Military, you can
that's what I said. Yeah. Pulling the nose around and stuff. Yeah.
Or you can translate without changing angle of attack. You can move vertically.
Yeah, but they didn't put it on for efficiency.
No, they put it on to keep their guns on target.
Yeah.
Okay. Then you've got, you know, the XB-70.
Yeah. The big old bomber. They built 2 of them.
And they crashed one in a photo op.
Right.
Oh, no.
No, like a plane flew across and sheared the vertical stabilizers off. The one that remains is at Wright-Patterson.
Okay.
And you can go look at it. And there's a good technical write-up on it. They discovered what they call shockwave lift. The engines are in 2-3 packs underneath the wings, and there's a vertical separator between the two.
This isn't like looks like an SSC?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, this was built 20 years before the SSC.
No, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
And so that vertical separator generates a tremendous shockwave because this thing's going Mach 1.8 or something like that.
Yeah.
And that shockwave, they've shown that it generates a lift wave underneath that flat body, that the top of the engine inlets and the vertical separator forms like a shockwave surfboard type of thing. That's the concept, and they think they get about 10 or 20% of the lift out of that at high velocities.
Yeah,
so it's interesting.
No, I know. Well, look, clearly it'd work on some level, even at its low speed, right?
And your knuckleball here in the middle, if you don't have any spin on it, those vortices on the back side tend to make the thing go like this.
Yeah,
and you don't know where or when it's going to go.
There's a name for that. When they throw it without any spin, it's
it's the same
crazy
thing with,
ball or something like that.
Same thing with musket balls. Yeah, spitball. No, that's different. The musket balls the same way without rifling.
Yeah.
They tend to duck around on their trajectory of flight. But as soon as you spin it, you give it some gyroscopic stabilization.
Yeah.
You know, you're talking, your discussion about the XB-70.
Yeah. So
The Russians had a whole group of airplanes that literally operated on ground.
Oh yeah, they never got off the ground.
Well, they got about 4 feet off the ground.
Pictures above lakes.
And what they did is, you know, they had all this snow and ice, and all these huge lakes. And to go across the Caspian Sea, they had these things that were incredibly heavy, but never got more than about yay high off the ground. Compression. Amazing. Other questions? Oh, come on, John, don't, you're gonna get a frown.
Thank you.
Don't feel obliged. Okay.
Let's talk about some more exotic stuff. The SR-71.
Yes.
Have you ever looked at the wing shape on that? It's extremely compound curvatures.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're trying to figure, how does this thing fly? Because they're curving up and down and sideways. And it's because of the speed. You know, in Mach 3, you've got a lot of mass flow rate over this thing, and so you don't need much angle of attack at all. And where does that angle of attack occur at different velocities? It's different places on the wing.
Well, that's why they had trouble breaking the sound barrier. Below the sound barrier, the center of lift is 1/4 of the way back. At the sound barrier, above the sound barrier, it's halfway back. So what happens is, here's your lift, you come up, and you finally come to break the sound barrier. It goes back here, which lowers the nose, and it goes forward, and then it brings the nose up, and it goes back, and it just rattles the wing off.
Yeah, the other thing they were flying at is that on those early planes, when they're trying to go supersonic, they had typical elevators on them.
Oh yeah, yeah, and then
And when you turn the elevator, then you create the vortex at the elevator, and so the elevator loses its ability to control the airflow.
well, it's had behind a shockwave, so there was no airflow.
And it actually goes backwards.
Yeah.
So
we
now
should do this afterwards. We should let these people let these people go.
Let's thank our speaker.
John, Dave.
And
Can I ask a question?
sure.
So when you're on an airplane and you look out the window and they're landing, they're always doing something with the flaps on the wings.
Yeah.
And what are they actually doing there?
They're making it a Bernoulli, a nice smooth curved wings, so that the air can flow. It can go at a higher angle of attack at a slower speed without stalling.
They're increasing the wing.
So it's allowing them to slow the airplane.
Yeah, without falling out of the sky.
Yeah. We'll have to talk about this offline. You brought up the SR-71, which is the thing that always amazes me is that thing was actually designed in the early 60s.
Almost with a slide rule.
Yeah, and the wings are interesting. The engine designs are phenomenal.
High constant bypass, constant afterburning.
Yeah, well, and no, they are not fuel efficient. Our guests have been with us from AGI for 3 days now. Edward has a little presentation, 15 minutes or so, about what AGI is doing in